Hey everyone, welcome to Masonzero MTG. I had a comment recently asking for a breakdown of my Pauper Cube, and I realized that while I make videos about cards from new sets for Pauper Cube, I don't have any videos about the actual cube that I own. So let's get into it. Most of this is going to be about the design philosophy and how I pick cards rather than going through every individual card, because you can just go look at my cube list linked in the description. Mana curve. The majority of commons that are worth playing are pretty much 3 mana and under, except for big dumb green creatures of course. This means that most of the cards in my Pauper Cube are of a pretty low mana cost relatively. For the sake of the mana curve, there are many cards that cost 4 to 7 mana in all colors, but most of these cards, especially upwards at 6 and 7 mana, have some cost reduction options or alternate abilities like cycling or channel. Downshifted cards. Over the last few years especially, there have been many uncommons and even some rares that have been shifted down to common. These are cards I always like to take a look at, as they are often more powerful or more versatile than other cards that were originally printed at common. I have quite a few of these shifted cards in my cube, which I hope increases the power level and the flexibility of the card pool. Unique cards. I have tried to make the basis of my cube based on popular cards commonly used in Pauper Cube. After all, there's a reason that these cards are played. So looking at my list, there's of course many standards that you'll recognize. But since there are thousands upon thousands of commons in Magic, I had room to add some interesting cards that maybe you haven't heard of. For example, Cube Cobra recommends that I cut cards like Survivor's Bond, Fervent Cathar, Viashino Slaughtermaster, and Mortis Strider. But I like these cards a lot, and I love showing off some forgotten or ignored cards that work in my themes. Repeatable effects and powerful effects. Common cards often do things once when they enter the battlefield, or they just have some abilities, and it's hard to find good cards that have repeatable effects. That's why I tried to focus on cards that improve as the game goes on, or can provide ongoing value, or that have a very useful one-time effect or keyword. Battle Plan, in addition to having land cycling, provides a buff to a creature every turn, and unlike an aura or equipment, is not tied to just one creature. This keeps it flexible throughout the game. Crunch Wrangler gets counters as you play larger creatures, making it a threat as the game goes on. Sinuous Vermin can come down early and become larger later on in the game when you have the mana. In terms of powerful one-time effects, Miss Raven is a bounce spell attached to a flying body that I would rather play than just an unsummon. Parhelion Patrol just has so many keywords while also providing value as a way to buff smaller creatures in combat, which makes it great at various stages of the game. Multicolored cards. Good multicolored cards are hard to come by at common, and they generally fail to serve the same purpose as multicolored uncommons, that being to serve as signposts for drafting. Generally, they only exist because they are from a multicolor heavy set where both commons and uncommons got several multicolored cards. So usually they just serve whatever theme is in that color combination rather than pointing you towards it. These common gold cards occasionally offer a build around, especially when it comes to cards that were downshifted in rarity, but they're usually just cards that grant additional power and flexibility in exchange for being more difficult to cast or to splash. However, I am a fan of multicolored cards in every format, and I think they're a lot of fun, so I tried to find ones that were powerful enough to match the power level of the rest of the cube. Cycles. I've tried to have some cycles of cards in this cube, and this has changed over time. I used to have a cycle of the expensive suspend cards in each color, but settled only on the white one as worth running. Each color has a land cycling card, and currently I am running the ones from March of the Machine because they are relatively playable outside of just their cycling abilities. I also used to have a cycle of land cycling, non-creature spells, but have ended up cutting those down to just the colors I felt were worth playing. Each color also has a Monarch card, with blue deviating from the Conspiracy cycle. Each color has 2 lands. One is the Thriving cycle, which are just build your own dual land, but also one land that is monocolored and has an enter the battlefield effect that is relevant to that color. Finally, I have the cycle of common 3-colored creatures from New Capenna. I like these cards because they allow for early game fixing in a unique way, then can be cast later in the game and have a small effect. Plus they have cool gilded foil versions that look incredible when you open your pack. Themes. Draft themes can certainly exist at common, however there are much fewer build-arounds than at higher rarities. This means that synergy exists between cards, but there aren't many single cards that you will try to build your deck around. This is because commons tend to do things just once, or synergize with just themselves, or synergize with a wider strategy that would generally be supported by uncommons and rares. Uncommons and rares tend to have the word whenever printed on them pretty often, making them great to build around, but commons just don't have that. This does mean that themes are a little bit more generic overall, although you could certainly make some interesting themes at the cost of flexibility due to a smaller card pool around a very specific type of theme. In my cube, I opted for flexibility and raw power more than specific draft themes in most cases, and I'll get into those themes right now. The overall theme of the cube in all colors is definitely graveyard synergies. Every color cares about the graveyard in some way, and many cards interact with it. I think this makes it feel like players have access to more cards than just the ones in their hand, through cards that have cycling, flashback, adventure, various recursion abilities, and more. White. White focuses on cheap creatures and getting into combat, but I would consider it more of a support color here, as many cards care about what other creatures are doing and buffing them up, or biding you time to build your board state. However, there are some cards with heroic and some blink synergies. Blue. Blue's central theme is flying, which makes sense considering it's blue, but there is one card that actually is a build around. Beyond flying, there are some blink synergies as well as plenty of counterspells and other control cards in order to build an effective control deck. Black cares about the graveyard, which is not surprising. Expanding on things being in the graveyard, there are a lot of cards that can sacrifice other creatures and some cards that can return from the graveyard. As you might expect, there is also a fair amount of removal, but not an overwhelming amount since I want creature combat to be a little more prevalent. Red. Red, of course, has aggressive creatures and burn spells. I would say thematically it's split between combat-oriented creatures and support for Spellslinger's decks. There is also a cycling sub-theme, but it's pretty minor, and you might just encounter it on accident. Green. Green's best creatures are large, of course, so I focused on expensive but efficient creatures and the ramp needed to get there. I tried to make an interesting sub-theme of caring about lands in the graveyard as well. Multicolored themes. Like I said before, the themes are pretty broad in this cube, however there are a few more specific themes if you choose to draft a two-color deck. Azorius's crossovers are blink and flying, but the gold cards don't necessarily reflect this. Dimir is kind of generic control and grindiness. Rakdos is, you guessed it, about sacrifice. Gruul, just stompy. Selesnya is sort of tokens and maybe a little bit of +1/+1 counters. Orzhov's theme specifically is Resurrection and actually does have a build around multicolored card for this. Izzet is spell slinging, of course, and the multicolored cards do reflect this very well. Golgari definitely cares about cards in the graveyard even more than all the other color combinations. Boros specifically cares about being aggressive with your attacks and has some heroic crossover. Finally, Simic is value, naturally not having any particularly special identity, mostly card filtering in order to find your big threats. So that's a lot about design philosophy, and hopefully the cards I showed during this video give a good impression of what my Pauper Cube does. I'm not going to go through all 360 cards, but my full list is linked in the description and I'm happy to answer any questions about why I chose a specific card or why I didn't add some other specific card, and of course if you have any suggestions on what would make one of these themes more interesting. Let's chat in the comments or over on my Instagram at MasonZeroMTG if you want to have a longer discussion about this cube and the cards in it. Anyways, thanks for watching and I'll see you in my next cube guide.